Hello, good evening, CRSEA family. Thank you for joining us for a founders interview. I am Dr. Timberly Baker, and I'm excited about this opportunity to speak to Dr. Marvin Lynn. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and get right into our questions and time together. So tell us your name and your current role.
So my name is Marvin Lynn. Currently, I am a Dean of the College of Education at Portland State University. I'm also a professor.
So tell us about your role as a founding member and just sort of generally development around CRSEA.
So back in, I would say the spring of 2007, I think it was, a bunch of us were talking about AERA and our concern that it appeared that AERA was not very open or embracing of critical race scholarship, at least not all critical race scholarship. There were some scholars at that point that were getting their papers accepted. They were getting a symposia accepted, and then there were others that were not. It just so happened that during that year, myself, I think Tara Yoso was another person who had some real concerns around that. Now, I have to say, Tara Yoso and I had been very successful at AERA in talking about CRT. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, you know, we both had large panels that were well attended at AERA. In fact, I put together a panel in the late 90s, early 2000s with Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate and a number of other people. And so we had that experience of having done that work very successfully at AERA. But we got to a point where it seemed like we were no longer having the same kind of progress or success with getting our proposals through. And again, Tara Yosa and I both came together and said, what's going on? And it's so very interesting because at that time, AERA was being led by Black folks, you know, very prominent Black folks, right? And so we started to think, well, is it that sort of Black people have a more narrow kind of understanding of what counts as CRT and what's really happening? We just sort of, you know, we're having lots of discussions. And so we started talking about building an alternative space for having critical race theory and education conversations that could support emerging scholars of color, but also more seasoned scholars of color. And Tara Yoso and I were sort of right at the point where we were getting tenure or had just gotten tenure. So we were kind of crossing that bridge in terms of being kind of, you know, untenured to being tenured or senior and so on. And so we were thinking about our graduate students. We were thinking about our newer assistant professors who were coming along and trying to do this work, but didn't really have a space in which to do it. And we thought, boy, if we're getting rejected from AERA, that's what's happening to less experienced folks, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so it came out of our frustration, our anger around feeling like suddenly we were not accepted, and we needed an alternative space in which to do this work. And so the Critical Race Theory and Education Conference, I think, is what it was initially called, just a conference. And then when Thea Berry and David Stovall also joined forces with us, Thea helped us to think much more about an association, right? That we could do an association that was then going to be connected to an annual conference. And so it was born. I think the first conference we had at the University of Illinois Chicago in 2008. You know, and so the rest is history. It's continuing from that point on.
Yeah, quite literally a moving history. So talk to me about critical race theory's role in your own pedagogy and scholarship. So how do you move with it in your work?
Interestingly enough, I've never really taught a course on critical race theory until last year.
Really?
Yeah, the first time I taught a course on critical race theory, I was a dean.
Wow.
Last year.
Wow.
And so I had to write to all of my colleagues who've been doing this work for so
Mm-hmm.
long to ask, hey, can you share with me your syllabi? I'll
Yeah.
tell you why that is.
Mm-hmm.
When I started my career at the University of Maryland as an assistant professor,
Mm-hmm.
I developed a program on minority and urban education. It was a master's and doctoral program. And so I had to develop courses on urban ed, on minority ed, on multicultural ed.
Mm-hmm.
And those were kind of the core areas of focus for me. As a scholar and a teacher, I always kind of interweaved critical race theory,
Yeah.
literature, and
Mm-hmm.
discussion throughout my subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have the opportunity to teach a standalone course at the University of Maryland on critical race theory. Um, and that's an interesting thought about, when I think about that, why didn't that occur? And
Yeah.
um, it just didn't happen. And when I think back on it, I don't think that it's happening today either.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I was, the guy who developed and taught the urban education course, and I interweaved those things. And then when I got to the University of Illinois, Chicago, well, I was on faculty with Dave Stovall.
Right.
So guess who was teaching the critical race
Right.
theory course, right?
I wonder, right?
So that opportunity didn't exist there. But what I did teach at the University of Maryland that at UIC, that was really important was an African American education course.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had doctoral students and master's students reading, James, the dean at the University of Illinois, James Anderson's work
Mm-hmm.
for the first time. I had, and so on. And so that was really critical to me, and also connected to Black education history. So it hasn't been a part of what I've done pedagogically, but it's been absolutely central to my scholarship. And so I saw my role very early on in the movement. I talked in this publication that is coming out recently about being invited to participate in a research apprenticeship course at UCLA, where I went to graduate school with Daniel Solorzano, who was my mentor. And so having the experience of not only being exposed to critical race theory fairly early in its development. I mean, this was 1997, 98, right, where I was learning about critical race theory, and the movement had only really come into being formally in the sort of early 90s.
In education,
Right, but critical race theorists know that the term critical race theory itself, my understanding, was coined at a conference in 1993 by Kimberly Crenshaw. So even critical race theory as a discrete thing with a name was a fairly new thing. Now, what you learn about critical race theory is that it has existed, through time immemorial.
Right? Yeah.
All these other discourses, ethnic studies, Black studies, women's studies, Marxism, and so these conversations have been going on for hundreds of years.
Right.
But the thing that we call critical race theory as a discrete kind of academic field of study is a fairly new thing. And so I was fortunate to kind of get in on it fairly early on. And then, yes, Larry Parker, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Bill Tate, and people like that, Daniel Solorzano were doing the work in critical race theory and education that came about. I think one of the first pieces we saw was early 90s, Bill Tate, and then 95, 96, and so on. Right. And so that work was also very new. And so I had the chance to kind of get in on it and explore it in a scholarly way, and then connect it to my research on Black teachers. And so I published a piece in 1999 called Toward a Critical Race Pedagogy, which was my effort to really think about, how does critical race theory help me think about the struggles and the plight of African-American educators in public schools? Yeah. And just a lot of illuminative findings that came out of that work.
Right. And I think it's so interesting what you just said around, one, for our viewers of this interview, too, to think about really how you can, even if you don't have an explicit critical race theory course, right, ensuring that you're weaving it into the courses that you might have that aren't named as such, but that theoretical underpinning and content for your students, that exposure is still there, that analysis is still there, that it can be synthesized into these other areas. And it's interesting too that you say, not only did you not have it explicitly in a course until becoming dean, but
Right.
that you then, though, in your scholarship, though, we're talking about it in context of K-12 teachers, or, of public school teachers. So how do you think CRT as theory, right, sort of how we learn it in its purest, right, form, then diverges, or how is it sort of all linked in around method, right? So CRT is theory and as method. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and in my dissertation, I had the opportunity to think about it in both ways, and I tried to talk about it in both ways. As a theoretical construct that situates how we understand the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
How we understand the specific institutions that we are trying to study, right? And so if you take a critical race lens to look at schools and schooling, you have to be concerned about race and how race and
Right.
racism are implicated in influencing outcomes, but also how it influences the very structures in which schools exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
It requires you to kind of have a foundational analysis of not only school, but society itself in terms of understanding how it's been shaped and influenced by race, and then how that then again influences the outcomes, right? And so that's very, very critical. The critical race method piece then was really shaped and influenced by the work of people like Garrett Duncan, who was talking about a critical race ethnography,
Mm-hmm.
or Daniel Solorzano and Tara Yoso,
Mm-hmm.
who talk about and articulate a critical race method.
Right.
And Garrett Duncan's work is very interesting because he has this notion of Black males being beyond love, which I think is very relevant right now, right?
Right. Yeah.
Given the time, right? Um, that people sort of don't see them as lovable, and that they aren't worthy of that. And so when you talk to teachers about Black male students, that's the sense that you get. And so he was trying to articulate an ethnographic method that was somehow sensitive to that condition. He talked about
Mm-hmm.
liminality, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
something that
Yeah.
Paulo Freire articulates in his,
Right.
but that Black males being in this liminal
Space.
space, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we create a method that's sensitive to that, and that responds to the needs of Black male to be loved, Black males to be loved. And
Mm-hmm.
then Solorzano and Yoso kind of talk about what it looks like in terms of building a counter story, like the counter
Mm-hmm.
story method,
Right.
and how one has to um, read very deeply within the literature, right? And then the composite storytelling
Mm-hmm.
process, and how that occurs, and so on. And so I think that really influenced my dissertation writing, which was really about trying to tell the stories of Black male teachers in a way that reflected what Lawrence Lightfoot calls, goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so many stories of Black people that do not
Right.
reflect goodness. And so I was trying to use whatever power, whatever voice I had and have to reflect goodness in the lives and stories of Black male teachers who were, at the time that I was writing about them, kind of a missing element. And so my method had to be sensitive to kind of their cultural understandings,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of their positionality as Black men. And it had to be situated within their voices, and it had to tell their stories from their perspectives as much as possible. But I drew also on portraiture by Sir Lawrence Lightfoot,
Mm-hmm.
um, as a way to also sort of insert my own understandings as a Black male into the conversations I was having with these teachers. So when I had questions or when I had issues or concerns, I raised them in a way that was respectful of who these educators were. So yeah, absolutely. I think a critical race method attends to, the needs, the issues, the concerns that impact particularly racially marginalized people, and
Mm-hmm.
that we are trying to tell their stories. Often these are stories about injustice. These are
Right.
stories about white supremacy and racism,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in how it's enacted, right?
Right.
And how they then experience it and live it out. And I think that's very, very important that we tell those stories in a really sensitive, caring, but also really rich and detailed
Mm-hmm.
way. that attends to, structure and the role of structure. And when I say structure, I'm talking about white supremacy as a structure.
Yeah.
Um, um, and so I think all those things are important. And I think critical race method allows one to kind of bring those things together in a nice way. And it also, I think, gives you the opportunity to use story, counter story, as a way to further enrich those narratives.
So this is kind of a one-off question based on what you just said and just sort of generally your reaction. And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot too in relationship to method, because frequently CRT method is, at least to me, talked about in very qualitative ways. So what are your thoughts on quantitative applications of CRT as method?
Yeah, so I'm a qualitative researcher, but in our handbook of critical race theory and
Mm-hmm.
education, Adrian
Yep.
Dixon and I, there are a couple of chapters that
Right.
focus on quantitative
Mm-hmm.
on research. And part of what they have been doing is trying to debunk this notion that all quantitative research is racist, right? In its orientation. I think they try to argue that we can use quantitative research that looks at particular outcomes, for example. People do quantitative analysis to sort of compare reading levels of Black and brown children to white children in school districts, and they try to sort of make some kind of inference about what that means or what that suggests about those kids or about those communities. And I think the critical race scholars who are quantitative researchers are trying to better understand inequality and its function, and to use those data as a way to better tell a story about inequality. I think they also are strong advocates for kind of a mixed methods approach that integrates some qualitative analysis, and maybe integrates a little bit of storytelling as a way to bring some, for lack of a better word, color to the narrative that the quantitative research is telling. Because quantitative research in and of itself is limited as sort of the sole way to tell a story about the experiences of people of color. But I think quantitative research and data and the analysis, if done in the proper way, can actually serve to build a strong foundation for the stories that we tell about injustice, particularly when you start looking at data that shows the disparities, for example, in education, in housing, in healthcare, in across a number of different sectors in our society.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really affirming. So I'm a quantitative scholar, and what you named is very much a lot of part of the challenges that I think are presented in trying to use CRT as theory, but then also as method in relationship to quantitative analysis. And because we are constantly struggling with the structural and foundational issues of quantitative analysis, and historically what they've been used to do to people that are marginalized. So I had to get that one in because I just wanted to know what you thought about it. So, is there any specific tenet of CRT that drives your work, and or a personal perspective, or that has really driven your development as a scholar or as a professional? So, sort of that intertwining of the professional and the personal. Is there a particular tenet that drives that?
I think all the tenets are really important to me, but the two that I thought that popped into my mind as you were asking me that question was the one around centering the voices and perspectives of people of color. And maybe today I'd say Black and brown and indigenous people, and people of color, BIPOC, I guess. Because I think Black, indigenous, and people of color is a little clearer than just saying people of color. But so I think that sort of insistence that BIPOC folks are at the center of the narrative is so critical to me, and has been critical to all the work that I do as a researcher, as a scholar. It's a constant effort of mine as a leader to also do that work in the same way. And so that's been really important. I think this idea too of recognizing the permanence of racism, but also working in some ways to end it. So, and those might seem like contradictory ideals, but in a way it's not, because I think what Derek Bell taught me was that while racism is permanent in the current society as it's
Yeah.
constructed because of the way it was constructed, that we should always be working against it.
Right.
And so I see the work I do as working against white supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
and as sort of centering people of color. And so those are the things or BIPOC people, those are the two tenets that I think are most central to the work I do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, what are your thoughts on CRT and its connection to the larger field of education, or even in your role as dean, right? Like, is there some really either concrete or practical ways in which you see it connecting to the work that you're currently doing, or just sort of across your trajectory, right? You've been in from assistant professor all the way to where you are right now, right? So, just connections to the larger field.
Well, I think, 20 years later, some years later, it's more than 20 years, um, I feel like we have a more specific, more appropriate understanding of race and racism and how it functions in schools.
Mm,
Um, when I started graduate school in 1997, one of the things I noted was it seemed we were very limited in
mhm,
terms of our understanding of race in general, but certainly we had no real clarity around how race was functioning in school settings. That there was a lot of talk, even amongst good liberal folk, about Black culture and
yeah.
what it lacked,
Mhm,
and that being a sort of primary contributor to school failure for Black children, particularly Black males, right?
mhm,
And so I was shocked that good liberal people were having that conversation, in the late '90s about uh, schooling outcomes for Black children.
mhm,
And so I saw the need for deeper analysis. There was a whole body of research, and it's still growing, on kind of culture
yeah.
and the way culture was influencing both positively and negatively Black children in schools. And the positive research was the more Afrocentric, African-centered literature
Mhm,
that
mhm,
highlighted the beauty of Black and African culture,
yeah.
and articulated an Afrocentric pedagogy and so on. And Peter Morrell,
Mhm,
there are a number of people who have done this work over the years. And so I found that work to be really enriching. Um, but critical race theory, I thought, offered something a little bit different in terms of its focus on race,
mhm,
racism, which we know has been so critical
yes.
in the lives of Black people, right?
Right.
And so to sort of think about what it means to focus on white supremacy and racism as an
Mhm,
overall construct, and to think about that from the standpoint of pedagogy was exciting and new and different. It was something
mhm,
that I had not seen. And so I think critical race theory has been really influential in the sense of helping this field better articulate and understand schooling and schooling processes and how they have impacted Black and Brown and Native students, or BIPOC communities. And
mm,
so that's been critical. Now, I still feel like critical race theory is still fairly marginalized within the field of
uh-huh,
education.
uh-huh,
I think it has really shaped the broader discourse around race in education,
mhm,
but I don't think it's front and center by any means.
right.
It's still not mainstream.
Mhm,
A lot of people uh, adopt, misappropriate critical race theory in ways that are really problematic in our
mhm,
field. You see people writing dissertations and books and other things using the term critical race theory, and they have no idea
idea.
what critical race theory is. And so Gloria Ladson-Billings talks a lot about the misappropriation of critical race theory, but she also says that in terms of culturally relevant teaching, right? How it's been
Right.
misused, appropriated.
Yeah.
So it's out there, but are we using it appropriately? Not all the time. Is it really embraced in the mainstream? Still, no. And so I think
Mhm,
there's still work to be done. I think there's still struggles that graduate students and younger, up and coming professors are still having in terms of trying to get their work legitimized by these
yes.
journals and so on.
Yeah.
And then I think we as a community have to be careful not to play favorites, right? I think,
Mm,
sometimes what we see is people like myself and beyond favoring their own graduate students over other
mhm,
people and
mhm,
so on, in terms of getting book contracts and other things. And so I think we have to also make sure that we open up opportunities for all, and whether they be publication opportunities or otherwise.
Right. And I think that's really, I appreciate you saying that, because as a junior faculty member and junior scholar, um, it's also challenging too when you sort of take up a theory where you don't necessarily have a someone present at your institution who's sort of expert, right, or more expert than yourself. And so, while on one hand, in your graduate program, maybe you had high exposure or not, right, as you move through the space and trying to get your content published, or just the work that you're doing, that it can be challenging. And to also the experience of the legitimacy on particular faculties too of your work, right? And their uh, how they place value or not on your
Yeah,
scholarship.
right. And then you get put in the position of teacher. You know, you have to try to teach everybody what critical race
Right.
theory is.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think sometimes that's productive, but a lot of times for junior folks, it's not very productive.
Right. And
Because
it's difficult to do.
yeah, yeah. You know, you have to be the instructor of other professors all the time. And, you know, I put the onus back on those professors to go and learn on your own
Mhm.
time so that you can figure out how to be more supportive of your junior colleagues.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And that sort of leads us into the next question, which is about the role of mentors and just how you see yourself as a mentor. So, sort of across time and space, how you think about mentors, and then also yourself personally as a mentor.
Yeah, as a mentor, I just try to be open and honest and available to people who reach out. I have several folks that I have worked with over the years in one way or another. You know, I had the experience of being a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago and having students like Cesare Warren and Ebony McGee and Goldie Muhammad. I mean, these are people who are superstars in the field right now. And so I feel really blessed and
Yeah.
uh, enriched. You know, my first doctoral student at the University of Maryland was A.D. Williams, who is now a department chair and a full professor at Cal State LA. But there were many other students at the University of Maryland. Thurman Bridges, who is a
Mm-hmm.
department chair at Morgan State University, you know, that I had a chance to work with at the University of Maryland. So every institution that I've had the opportunity to affiliate with, I've had students, either if I was their chair or I was on their committee, to just kind of be there for them. And
Yeah.
you know, when they come back and say, "Hey, I'm applying for a fellowship, will you write me a letter?" Absolutely. You know,
Right.
every big award that some of these really famous people have gotten, I've hopefully had a hand in and been able to support, and that's important. You know,
Yeah.
our students need that, and it's important that we be there for them and we be able to come through with those reference letters and
Mm-hmm.
or whatever they need to kind of move their careers forward as they get into the profession. So that's really critical to me.
Mm-hmm.
It also means that we have those difficult conversations at times about strategy in terms of dealing with racism and white supremacy in the academy. You know, if I see, I've also had conversations with scholars. If I see something that, look, I think that's problematic. You know, I'd
Mm-hmm.
say, can you help me understand why you're engaging in that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
is that really
Mm-hmm.
useful for you? So I'll have those conversations too.
Yeah.
Um, and and at the end of the day, I think it's about a relationship and it's about supporting each other and making sure that we can all advance and move forward together as a community. And that's what mentorship is,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think for me, because it's also listening and learning. I mean, I learned so much from the people that I've been able to mentor, and so I'll invite them to Portland State and other places to come and speak and be involved. You know, and then I'm like, wow, the stuff that people are doing, you know, today to bring together their research with their teaching, with their mentorship, and their activism, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's so awesome. And so I'm enriched by those relationships in incredible ways.
That's cool. Yeah. When you think about it, I'm not at the point in my career yet, right, where I have graduate students that I'm like, oh man, you know, look at the amazing things that you're doing. But that has to be really fulfilling too, to be on the side of it at this point where you're looking at those that you helped or that you supported along the way, and they're doing these things that are just that you see real value in too.
That's right.
There's
That's right.
such beauty in that, to be able
And
to be a part
I
of
have
it.
to say, you know, Daniel Solorzano was a key mentor and supporter for me. And I talk about this in some of the writing that I've done about how I got to UCLA with that first year. And I was in a unit that I thought was a good fit for me based on my interest. And it turns out that that was not a good unit. So I had to transfer over to a different unit where Daniel Solorzano was there. And suddenly I was immersed in these conversations about race. Whereas before I was using terms like poverty of theory because I felt like, boy, people don't know how to talk about race. What is going on? And it was frustrating for me.
Yeah.
Because I was supposed to be learning how to do that as an emerging scholar. And then suddenly I was in a situation with Daniel Solorzano where not only were people doing that and doing that well, right? There was then so much for me to learn in terms of the literature on critical race theory so that I could figure out how to do that in a really great way. So it was a wonderful development for me working with Daniel Solorzano, and he connected me to Larry Parker and Bill Tate and Gloria Ladson-Billings and all these other scholars who also mentored and supported me all along the way. Larry Parker and I have published quite a bit together. I think I probably published with Larry Parker more than I have with anybody else. And two of the pieces that I published with Larry Parker are my most popular pieces right now in the field. Larry Parker was also part of a couple special issues that we did early on to kind of bring attention to critical race theory. And so he has been an incredible mentor for me as well. So for me, working with the students that I identified, and there are many, many more that I did not mention, is a way to give back because so much was given to me.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that too. And I think it's an encouragement as well for those of us who are graduate students, finding solid mentors to assist you, but then also as junior faculty members, sort of the ways in which you can move through and become the mentor that you either need to be or wanted to have, right? For those that have had positive mentorship and those that hadn't necessarily. So with that, what would be your advice to junior scholars, graduate students looking to use CRT in their research or in their pedagogy, and just sort of talk about it both from the benefits, but then also some of the limitations that it creates too?
Yeah, there are great benefits in using CRT because I think it's the most comprehensive understanding of race that you could probably have. I've studied race and racism in sociology. I've looked at it from the standpoint of anthropology and political science. I had the opportunity to do that at UCLA. It was amazing. And I was working with scholars who were in all of those fields, but who were also interested in race. And I can tell you that what people are doing in the law is broadly inclusive and comprehensive of all of those areas of study, right? Which is why I think critical race theory is such a wonderful space in which to understand and do race. There's also some work in philosophy, David Thiel Goldberg, right? And others who are doing that work and have been doing that work for a long time. But again, if you read critical race theory deeply, and you gotta start with the law, because that's where it originated, and you've got to read that foundational literature. You got to read everything Derek Bell wrote, and there's a lot.
Right. That is so true. Yeah.
People call Derek Bell the father of critical race theory. And so you got to spend time with Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, and so on, are just important people. And you've got to read not only their books, but also their scholarly articles that were written in the law reviews, because what you see in the edited books is sort of shortened versions of those articles that I think you've had to really dig into. Daniel Solorzano taught me that. He'd say, okay, you have Kimberly Crenshaw's edited book, but let me tell you, this is a shortened version of that.
Right, so go back to the initial article.
He would send us to UCLA Law Library, which I didn't know was such a gift at the time. I mean, it's really, UCLA Law is one of the leaders in critical race studies, both from the standpoint of teaching, but also research, because of the presence of people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Cheryl Harris, Devin Carpato, and others. So that's a gift to anybody who wants to dig deeply in the law. And then there's all this stuff in education that I think one has to connect to and avail themselves of as well. I think that the challenging side of it you mentioned is that not everybody's ready to talk about race, and there will be people who will see anything with the word critical in it as a threat.
Yes.
You say critical race,
Yeah.
that's even deeper, because
That's a
while they
double
might be,
threat.
that's right, while they might be prepared to talk about critical Marxism or critical feminism, they're not ready to talk about race in that same way.
That's a
now,
good point.
we're in a kind of different historical moment right now
Right.
because of what happened with George Floyd. Right.
Right. But we've only been in this moment for about 2 weeks. So.
Right. Right. So people are like, tell me about that. Tell me about white supremacy. Oh, okay. Good. Let's talk about it. We've been trying to do this for 25 years.
Right. Exactly.
So I'm like, hey, I'm taking all kinds of opportunities. I mean, I've had several webinars talking about how to talk to children about race and all these things. And I'm excited about the opportunities that are being presented now. But we know that is not as you were saying, that hasn't been our condition.
Yeah.
And it's very likely that this period will pass and we'll go back to something more like what we were in before, where people are saying, why are you trying to hurt white people's feelings by using the word white supremacy? Right. And so that's what we deal with when we try to have these conversations. And that is the downside of it, right? Because it can influence your opportunities for leadership. I had a mentor tell me one time, he says, you'll never be a superintendent or a dean. Now, I guess he was wrong about that, but
clearly.
But his notion was that, when you talk about race in a critical way, that people see it as such a threat that they don't envision that you could then lead anything, right? Because that is so threatening. And I'll be honest with you, as a dean, as a Black dean who espouses critical race theory, I do have people that sort of respond to me in that way. And that is a kind of ongoing challenge for somebody who is doing this work, but who's doing it, primarily with white folks, right? Who are tenured professors and so on. And what does that mean about opportunities for kind of open conversations? What I've tried to do was create the space for those folks to engage in discussions about race in communities of other folks who are like them, but create opportunities. I have a person who is a coordinator for equity, diversity, and inclusion, who is, like my faculty read Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility this year and sat with it for weeks, right? And talked about sort of, how does this apply to me? How am I enacting this in the classroom, in my interactions with other people of color, right? And have to really reflect and read it in a really deep, critical way. That was one of several pieces around race and racism from the perspective of women of color, white women, and so on, that they read this year. So I see, critical race theory giving me the opportunity to influence that type of work in a really knowledgeable, substantive way. Whereas I know some of my colleagues, who are trying to do this work and trying to help people come to better understandings about the way the world works, don't have the background I have and can't do it to the same degree. And so in that sense, it's a gift. And so, I understand what my mentor was saying. That was Peter McLaren. I'll just be honest. We said, man, and Peter was saying it as a way to support me, because he's like, look, people who do the critical discourse work or the critical analysis work don't get leadership positions, right? He was never. And so, and at the time, I didn't aspire to that, but thank God I've been able to use it as a way to help me think about what it means to be more of a social justice leader. And I think we're in a moment right now where that is so needed.
Yes.
And I think probably a little bit less rejected than maybe it was, a month ago.
Right, a month ago, right.
Exactly. We'll take that opportunity too,
Yeah, that's such a good point, that the moment that we're in, that for many of us, our scholarship has prepared us for the moment that we're in, right? In ways that we previously weren't able to immediately be responsive to, depending on where you're located, right? Or depending on sort of where you sit and how you move in this space. And I would totally agree with you that. And I think even as graduate students, there's probably some folks that as grad students are able to facilitate conversations, help those who are coming to them, right, to navigate in meaningful ways these issues around critical race theory, or just critical race conversations too, right? Like critical conversations on race. And and that being really important. So I appreciate you naming that for us in really meaningful ways too, but then also the limitation around perceptions of leadership spaces.
Right.
And hopefully due to this moment that's shifting, right, and changing, that we won't be as limited as prior to now that we were as critical scholars to, or specifically critical race scholars, to move.
We can only hope. I think Black people who uh, attain any measure of success in their field, we're, and you know this because you're a
Yeah.
successful Black person,
Thank you.
there's an expectation that you be a politician, right? That you make people comfortable, that you smile all the time, right?
It's
You're
so
smiling
true.
now, but that's a genuine smile
Right.
because of,
Yeah.
we're connecting around this
Yep.
issue. And I always tell people, I don't smile unless something's funny. I'm not gonna walk in the room,
Right. Cheesy. Yeah.
what am I gonna do for what?
Mm-hmm.
And people sometimes require that kind of behavior
Mm-hmm.
of successful African Americans because they feel like, in order for you to be successful, in order for them to give you permission to be successful, you have to make them comfortable.
Right.
And I have never subscribed to that
Yes.
philosophy, right? And so it is a wonder that I continue to be in the positions and so on that I am, because I do not work to make people comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
particularly white folk who are racist. I think that has to be named and it has
Yep.
to be addressed.
Yeah.
Am I always the best person to name it and address it? Well, given my position of power, maybe not. But there are other ways, I think, in which we can work institutionally to name and address white supremacy and racism as it sort of shows up in our organizations. And no, it is not about the politics of comfort. Or respectability, right? That one has to always have every piece of hair in the right place,
Yeah.
and one can never speak Ebonics in public, and all these
Yeah.
kinds of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we sort of do within this double consciousness mindset that
Right.
E.B. Du Bois talked about to try to make people happy. And so I think we do have to reject some of that stuff, of all of it, as we move forward, because if we can't be authentically ourselves, I think that leads to a lot of negative health consequences for us.
Yes.
Right? People wearing that mask and it's faking it till you make it. Well, you're not gonna make it. You're
Make
gonna
it,
die.
right.
Because
Make it
racial
till
battle
you
fatigue
up out of here. Yeah.
okay, racial battle fatigue will kill you.
Yes.
So you better be who you are, because it's unhealthy to do anything other than that.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And you got to be who you are, because can't nobody else do it.
That's right.
You are created for a purpose, and this is part of it.
Yeah.
So I just really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you this evening and to go through some of these questions and just hear from you on your own experiences around, starting off as a CRT scholar, or rather starting Critical Race Studies and Education Association and CRT, and your development through that even to this point. And so my last question is sort of a one-off or offhanded. You didn't see yourself becoming a dean. Do you see yourself going beyond the deanship to wherever else that might take you?
I have days where, yes, that is absolutely my goal and my intention. And I have other days where I think, no way.
Yeah. I can't fool with y'all no more.
Right? I think that the college presidency is in a kind of critical moment of transition right now. And it doesn't matter whether you're Black or white or politically experienced or whatever. I think college presidents are going through a lot.
Yes.
So I would love for some of that to settle down before I think about it.
I'm gonna need y'all to just. It's okay. It's okay.
And then the provost job.
Yeah.
I used to think about that as a possible next step. As I learn more about that, I'm not so sure, because I'm a person who's very interested in community. I'm interested in thinking about how universities can be more engaged, particularly with communities of color.
Yes.
And civic identity and engagement, and those kinds of things. And so I'm thinking about my next step is maybe some work related to that. I don't know, that could look like a lot of different things.
Right.
And then I do think that then could lead potentially to some kind of university president job or something, and so I'm open. I also enjoy my research. I enjoy the connection to my family. I have, boys ages 18, 14, and 12, and
Okay.
I don't want to be in a professional situation in the next few years where I can't see my
Yeah,
children.
right. Yeah, that's so true.
So that's a big concern as well. And so I'm weighing all those things and trying to think very carefully about what my next step will be.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for the ways in which you continue to give to Critical Race Studies and Education Association as both a founder, as sort of an advisory, is continuing to provide guidance and just your work that you're doing, who you are as a whole. We are thankful and appreciative to you. So both for your time in this moment, but also for all the time you've given across the scope of the organization. So thank you, and you are appreciated. So
And you are appreciated as well. I mean,
thank
without
you.
you, this work doesn't continue, right?
Yeah.
So it's because of you that this work will continue and that generations to come will know about critical race theory and will know about the association and will be able to be part of it and to be able to participate in all the great work that's going on. So hats off to you and big thanks to you for this continued work.
Yeah.
Because there's labor involved, right?
Right.
And so that point isn't lost on me. And so
Hmm.
many thanks to you.
Yeah. Thank you.